Okay, so I see we already have a significant number of people in the audience, so let's kick off today's highly anticipated webinar on generative AI and the creative sector. I'm Lydia Detling. I'm Access Partnerships AI Policy Lead in Europe and delighted to be moderating today's discussion. This discussion is part of our AI Policy Lab, where our global team is working with industry and policymakers to address some of the biggest challenges facing the adoption of AI. Our previous events and studies and information on our upcoming events and topics such as measuring AI accountability to developing ethical AI are all available online, and we'll drop a link in the chat if you want to find out more. Today, though, we are focusing on deepfakes, generative AI, and the creative sector. We'll be looking at their current and developing applications and their implications in relation to misinformation and intellectual property law, and of course, how we can best regulate them in the context of the EU's AI Act. So here today to answer some of our burning questions is our fantastic panel of experts. Dr. Andreas Guadamuz, reader in IP law at the University of Sussex and editor-in-chief of the Journal of World Intellectual Property. Dan Nikita, head of cabinet of member of the European Parliament, Dragos Tudorache. Emily Antonis, senior vice president of governmental affairs of EMEA of Motion Pictures Association. Lodovico Benvenuti, Director of the European Office of the International Federation of Phonographic Industry. And finally, Paul Keller, Founder and Director at Open Future Institute. So before we jump into the discussion, I want to highly encourage our audience to engage in the conversation. We will have a Q&A session towards the end, so please do drop your questions in the chat and we will pick up as many of those as we can towards the end. And do stick around as well, because we will have a special announcement later. So panelists, to set the scene for our audience, could you maybe begin by providing a quick introduction and sharing your thoughts on some of the most significant current developing applications of deepfakes and generative AI in the creative sector? So Andreas, perhaps you could kick us off maybe by briefly also distinguishing between these two technologies.
Thank you very much. It's always a little bit difficult to be the first one to speak, so I'm going to try to make it brief. I've been talking and teaching about some of these subjects for a while. So whenever we're talking about generative AI in general, and this is not exactly a term of the art, but I like to think about artificial intelligence in two ways. Artificial intelligence that can transform something that already exists. It's not a term that is widely used, but I like to think about it as transformative AI, thing that we've had for many years, things like Adobe Photoshop and things like this. And then we have generative AI, which is roughly defined as something that is artificial intelligence is being trained on works, usually creative works, if we're talking about the creative industries, and it's able to generate something new, something that did not exist in real life. I'm sure that people have already been seeing in the news yesterday, for example, we saw a very good example of this. There were generated images of an attack on the Pentagon and the White House that were completely fake, generated. These things did not exist in reality. So whenever we're thinking about generative AI, we're thinking about these things. It's important to stress, and this is probably something that we're going to discuss later, is that these generations are not a collage or are not putting together little bits of information. It's generating content that does not exist. And this is perhaps a big distinction. Then also when we're talking about deep fakes, which is something different, it is a type of generative AI in some ways, but but usually what we are dealing with here is very specific training that has been done on one person, for example, so that it can actually generate the image, the voice, or the appearance of this person. Now we are starting to see deepfake music and things like this, but it's very specific, generated with one subject in mind. So you could say that deepfakes are a subset of generative AI. I hope I'll leave that to kick off the discussion. And I'm sure people will perhaps disagree with my own interpretation, but yeah, let's start with that.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. And Dan, I know the European Parliament is looking at both of these, so I'll turn to you next.
Thank you. Thank you, first of all, Lydia, for putting this together. This looks like a great discussion. And thank you, everybody, for joining. I think as first remarks, I will probably define a little bit more of what my role in this conversation can be. And that is, I work for Dragos Tudorache, who is one of the rapporteurs, meaning the lead negotiators for the European Parliament on the European Union Artificial Intelligence Act. And within this act, in Parliament in particular, we have also worked on setting a preliminary set of rules that we feel are appropriate for what I would call, and this is a whole theory, I'm not going to go into it, but I would call foundation models, that is very big and powerful models that are out there, mostly visible to the public when they are used in generative AI, but not exclusively. There are foundation models that are used for other things as well. But we have worked on setting some rules that I'd be happy to talk about a little bit later on how these models should be built, and specifically when they're used to do generative AI. Picking up on what Andreas was saying earlier, we have a very narrow and simple definition of what generative AI is, you know, it's AI that generates complex text, images, video, or content. And it's as simple as that. And among these rules, some have to do tangentially with copyright, but only tangentially. I'd be happy to talk about this a little bit more later. But I'll pass the floor now to the next speaker, and then when we get into the subject, I'll tell you a little bit more about that.
Perfect, thank you. Emily, I'll pass the floor to you next.
Thanks, Lydia. So from our point of view, of course, I mean, advances in technology have always played a very important part in enhancing the creation, production, development, and distribution of compelling audiovisual content. These developments have often been controversial at the time, but they have almost always ended up benefiting both creators and audience. So we also see great promise in AI. We believe that humans are and will remain at the heart of the creative process, but we also believe that AI can be a powerful tool to enhance the filmmaking process. So, for example, AI will further enhance the viewer experience, making visual effects more dramatic, more realistic, and also more enjoyable for the audience. So now enters indeed the AI Act that does present a certain challenge in this regard. Deepfakes were mentioned already, and the provision in the AI Act that deals with those are not necessarily linked to generative AI only. One of the risks that the AI Act wants to protect our society from is indeed deepfakes, because they entail risks of leading to misinformation or of meddling with elections, which we all agree is an existential threat to our democracies. So the AI Act therefore imposes a transparency obligation on the use of deepfakes. The thing is that if you look at how a deep fake is defined in the Commission proposal, which is an AI system that generates or manipulates image, audio, or video content that appreciably resembles existing persons, but also objects and places, and would falsely appear to a person to be authentic or truthful. Well, if you look at that definition, one could argue that this is exactly what our members do with visual effects, for example. Even though our audiences know that movies are not real, NPA members do intend to make their visual effects look as realistic as possible, and AI is a great tool for that. Audiences understand this and have no interest in being explicitly informed about this. On the contrary, transparency could actually seriously hamper the audience experience and even ruin the magic on the screen. So imagine the following, for example. I've prepared a couple of images to show what that kind of transparency could look like. AI in visual effects can, for example, be used on stunt doubles. Here we see Kate Winslet running through the lower decks of the Titanic. But she did not do this stunt herself. At the time, AI was not used for this, but today it probably would be. Imagine we would need real-time transparency on this. And on the big screen, you see this notice saying, attention, this is a deep fake. I think that would be very off-putting. But there are, other uses possible. If we look at the next slide, for example, you will see the Commission. This is a very dark one, but you can see the London Bridge somewhere there. Deepfakes also includes locations and objects even. So same thing, AI can be used for sets and locations, and here again, there would be a transparency obligation. The next one is an interesting one. I think we all remember Forrest Gump. There were a lot of historical events that were integrated in that movie, and a lot of fake encounters Forrest Gump had with presidents and famous people. So for example, here we saw Forrest Gump on a talk show with John Lennon. Again, obviously not really John Lennon in this scene. And I think the visual effect today would be much more smoother than it was back then with AI, but it would be a terrible viewer experience to have real-time notifications of this. So this is just kind of a worst-case scenario where deepfake transparency could lead to if we were included in this. Now, you will immediately understand that that is simply not an option. This would create a compliance nightmare at best, or stifle innovation on the use of AI in AV production at worst. So the Commission has anticipated this, that there shouldn't be such unintended consequences, and they have carved out uses that are necessary for the exercise of the right of freedom of expression and the right to freedom of the arts. Now, the co-legislators feared that these exemptions were maybe too broad and have therefore tried to narrow them down. So on the council side, they have on the one hand introduced that the deepfake transparency needs to be provided at the latest at the time of the first interaction or exposure. So in that case, you would have these real-time notifications, for example, in a film. But on the other hand, very helpfully, they completely excluded from the transparency obligations uses where the content is part of an evidently creative, satirical, artistic, or fictional work or program. And so this is an approach we can support, as it strikes the right balance between protecting our society against misinformation and protecting freedom of expression and creativity. And obviously the word evidently is key here, because it would exclude, for example, the images that were spread about the White House, as mentioned by Andres just earlier. So it's very important that it is very clear, of course, to the audience that they are actually looking at something creative. Now, in the Parliament, where a jury has the exclusive competence over this issue of Article 52.3, there is a little bit of a more complex compromise. But it basically comes down to the fact that disclosing the existence of a deep fake for creative uses has to happen in a way that does not hamper the display of the work. So that is very well intended to indeed avoid the kind of examples that I showed you. But it does raise some kind of compliance questions still. And one could actually wonder why disclosure is necessary at all for creative users, because they don't really have a risk for society. And these technologies have been used for decades and decades without ever posing a threat. So we really hope that the co-legislator will not forget about this important concern and risk in the final stretch that we have ahead of us on the AI Acts.
Thank you,
Thanks.
Emily. Thanks for those very concrete examples there. And I am certain we will turn back to that in just a moment. But sticking with the creative sector, Lodovico, I will pass to you. I think you're still on mute.
Thank you very much, Lydia. So introduce myself. I'm Lodovico Benvenuti. I'm the managing director of the European office of FPI. FPI is the organization representing the recording industry. It's better not to call it phonographic because people might get a little bit lost. It's an ancient way of calling us. We are a global organization. We represent, well, the three major companies, major labels that you all know, which are Universal, Sony, and Warner Music, plus 8,000 independent labels. As you probably know, the music industry has been at the forefront of several disruptions in the last 20 years, and we have been learning, managing, and surfing on these disruptions. And I think that recently we have shown quite successful examples on how we manage these disruptions. AI will not make any difference on this, so we are very optimistic about what this can do for the music industry, as long as this is instrumental to creativity and not trying to substitute or, let's say, steal creativity from those who are the real creators. So we are very much engaged both in making sure that AI is really benefiting to our main partners, which are the artists and the creators, and also to make sure that the legal framework is fit and puts the human creativity at the center. For this, I would like to just mention that there has been an initiative which started in the US but has become our global point of reference, which are the Human Artistry Campaign, which are 7 principles that have been agreed by now 40 organizations, many also European, representing the creative sectors. And I'm not going to list all the principles of this Human Artistry Campaign, but I will mention a couple. And one is very important in this context, which is that obviously a copyrighted work should be priorly authorized when it's used for AI-generated content. And secondly, another aspect which is very relevant, especially in the discussions that are taking place in the Parliament on the AI Act, which is that trustworthiness and transparency are essential to the success of AI. And I may add to our partnership with AI providers. So we think that transparency is crucial in order to future-proof our relation with this upcoming technology. So that's it.
Great, thank you so much. Paul, from a maybe broader perspective on innovation, could you kick us off with your introduction?
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this invitation and for the ability to contribute here. So I'm Paul Keller. I'm director of Open Future, which is a think tank related to openness in the digital environment. Like I'm also president of Communia, which is an association that works for promoting open access and the public domain. We've been at Open Future, we've been following all of these discussions around AI and generative AI with great interest. And have followed the discussions about the AI Act in the Parliament very closely. And let me go back to a couple of things that Dan and then Ludovico said. Like, so first of all, I think Europe is in an actually very good position here. Like prior to the AI Act, we had the discussions about the EU Copyright Directive between 2016 and 2019. And while the discussion wasn't framed very much being about AI or generative AI, it does contain some fairly fundamental decisions with regards that position European legal system ahead of this onslaught of this technology that we've witnessed over possibly the last year and established some principles. It says that certain foundational parts of training AI systems are framed in that directive as text and data mining, and there is a broad copyright exception that allows text and data mining and as a result ML training on copyrighted works for scientific research organizations and for cultural heritage institutions without any limitations on it. And secondly, there is a similar exception, but that also applies to any other users, so including commercial users, commercial companies who use copyrighted works for ML training, but that's subject to a rights reservation ability for rights holders and creators. So in Europe, we actually have a legal situation that is established, which says scientists, cultural heritage institutions can use copyrighted works that they have legal access to for training generative AI systems and other AI systems. But companies and everybody else working for profit purposes, but also other purposes, need to make sure that they exclude from their training any works for which rights holders have indicated that they do not want this to happen, that they do not want to contribute their works to this. Now, this raises obvious questions about how this can happen. Like this seemed to be like a somewhat theoretical discussion when this was adopted in 2019, but like this has come and hit us at force, and we're seeing a lot of discussions among creators, among rights holder organizations, a lot in the media about how can artists exercise control over their works. And obviously it's this opt-out. There's lots of questions how people can opt out. There's platforms who offer opt-outs. There is by now startups who build sort of opt-out infrastructures on top of this. Some of these companies have claimed to have like in excess of 1 billion opt-outs registered already. So there's a lot of movement in this space, but it raises two important questions. And one is partially answered, and I think Dan referred to that, by the Artificial Intelligence Act. Obviously, like this ability to opt out from training only makes sense if there's transparency. If I as a creator or if I as a rights holder can go in and demand from someone who has deployed an AI model to see which data has been used for the training. And we've seen in the latest versions in these provisions on the foundational AI models that Dan mentioned in his introduction, the introduction of requirements to provide at least summary information on copyrighted works. Like we would probably argue that there needs to be like more comprehensive transparency respects, not only summary, probably not only limited to copyrighted works, but I think the EU Parliament maybe by benefit of being the last of the three legislators to work on this act and having like a little bit more exposure to like the most recent developments, has done pointed at the right lever there and said like, if we need to regulate something on the interaction between copyright and ML training, artificial intelligence training, then that probably needs to be about transparency of training data. That's important for the creative industry. It's probably also important for societal insights into the use of this technology, for researchers and for the assessment of kind of like what these technology poses in terms of opportunities and damages. So I think we're in a good way. Like there's lots of little concerns that we might have with there. And I think I leave it at this at the moment, but I think actually as sort of like the European policymaking ecosystem, we can be quite proud that we actually have some rules that we can fall back at this moment, where in other parts of the world, this is still very much left open. and people are waiting for judges and courts to decide these things, we have a bit more of a stable legal framework here in Europe. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Yes, absolutely. One of the major questions here, and it seems that you're thinking that it's more of a question of enforcement rather than re-regulation per se here in Europe. But we'll definitely turn back to that in just a moment. But I want to firstly pick up on Emily's points on deepfakes. You mentioned the risks which such technologies can pose in terms of spreading misinformation and disinformation, but also application in the creative sector and finding the right balance. And Dan, I'd like to turn to you to give you an opportunity to reply maybe to some of the comments mentioned there on Article 52 and the European Parliament's and the EU's approach in general.
All right, thank you, Lydia. I've watched the PowerPoint with the very evident red text on disclosing that it's a deep fake, and I have to say that in Parliament we ourselves have sought to change a little bit what the Commission has proposed in terms of what is indeed deep fake, what exactly is that? And in the Parliament proposal that it's in the works, our definition of deep fake refers exclusively to persons. So it really is about when you impersonate somebody's face or voice that we feel that the regulation should apply to. Nevertheless, I do want to nuance a little bit the conversation. That's not how it will supposed to look like when you have to disclose that you've used a deep fake. It would probably have to go into the opening credits of a movie or in the closing credits, and we have foreseen, even though there is a different committee that deals with that particular article on transparency. We're working with them as well to make sure that evidently artistic works are not caught in this, but that really we are protecting against what really is the danger from deepfakes, that is intentional manipulation of the image of existing persons used mostly for non-positive purposes. But if you allow me, I want to go back to other topics as well. If you feel that I'm taking too long, cut me off. But this has been such an interesting conversation because it showed me, from a first round of intervention, what we have seen over the past year, that is different industries being affected differently by the rise of generative AI. And I would leave deep fakes aside. You could do deep fakes with Photoshop if you really want to. You could do it with older technology. But when we talk about generative AI, this has affected different industries in different ways. And we have tried a lot to interact with a multitude of actors, right? From AI providers, so from those who build the AI and know how they do it and understand it, all the way to civil society, to people who are affected by AI systems in different ways. So people, for example, people with disabilities, migrants, and so on, but also different sectors. And in this particular conversation, the creative sector. So here in the creative sector and in this industry, we've noticed two opposing views, right? One is, I would call the producers of content, who want as little obligations as possible and are confident that this technology will not disrupt their industry. On the other hand, we have had more and more alarmist calls from the actual creators and the small creators and the artists and the painters and everybody who are really, really freaked out. So it is interesting that within the same industry, there are different and diverging views on how this should be tackled. Now, I'll say a little bit about what we as Parliament have done. So what we have proposed and have voted already in committee. So we're ready to go probably for trialogues and to talk with council. In what generative AI is concerned, and especially generative AI derived from foundation models, the powerful systems, right? Because if you have an AI that generates a little poem out of 3 other poems, it's not really what we're trying to tackle. We have three conditions or 3 requirements for those who build these systems. And they're very simple. One is, of course, transparency requirements as per the article that outlines the transparency requirements. So no change there. Just make sure that you're transparent in terms of the content that you're showing to the end users. They know that they're interacting with an AI system. And here we're not talking about Kate Winslet. We're talking about your chatbot, then you're thinking you're talking to a real person, or a video clip of a famous star that you know all of a sudden discover on YouTube, which actually happened, right? And so on. So that's number 1. Number 2, we feel that at the moment when these systems are built, the builders of these systems can put in place some guardrails, a minimum set of guardrails for them to not generate content that is blatantly illegal in the union. You know, instructions on how to make a bomb, terrorist content, child pornography, and so on. These can be tackled at the building of the model. You just don't feed it data that teaches the algorithm, the model to generate that kind of content, and you put some filters in place on generating this extremely dangerous type of content. That's number 2. And then number 3, indeed, as I think Paul mentioned very acutely, shows that he's read the text that was just released. We have indeed a provision saying that they need to document and make publicly available a sufficiently detailed summary of the copyrighted material that they've used. Why this approach? We don't want, through the AI regulation, to go over or to change or to modify existing copyright laws. We don't want, on the other hand, to leave this issue untackled. So we feel, and I saw it just popped up on my screen, probably from the audience, a question on what exactly is transparency. I don't know where it came from, probably from the audience, but that is exactly what we felt is the approach: transparency. So tell the world that you've used copyrighted material, explain how you've used it, and then let the existing laws continue to function. But now you are becoming more responsible because you cannot use it in an illegal way, because then you would be exposed to the IP rights holders and to the artists and so on if you use their material without their consent. So that's what we've done. So I'll stop here for now, but just wanted to give this overview of exactly what's the status quo, what's the state of play of the work in Parliament on the Artificial Intelligence Act.
Great, thank you, Don. Very, very helpful. And yeah, nice transition into the question of copyright and IP concerns. And as you mentioned, obviously the different interests you're hearing from different stakeholders, different perspectives, even within the creative sector. And Lodovico, I'd like to turn to you. You touched already upon the principles of transparency and concerns for creators and artists. Maybe you could expand more on this, also touching on the specific ethical concerns for artists.
Yeah, by the way, I would like to politely disagree with Dan on one aspect, which is that we are divided between the small and big producers. So forth. If you look at the human artistry campaign that I just shared, this has been signed by every sort of part of the creative community, starting from the artists to the producers. I think that we are really jointly on the same on the same, I wouldn't call it fight, but on the same concerns and on the same project, which is to make sure that AI is instrumental to human creativity. And this human creativity starts from the original creator to the producer. So the producers on this topic have clearly chosen their part. That's their side, just to be crystal clear. Transparency is an essential tool in this field. Is it sufficient? Probably not. There are other aspects that need to be accompanying this, but it is absolutely essential, as I mentioned before, to have it. And I'm amazed that I agreed with practically everything that was said by Paul earlier, is that it is functional to make this work. Because without transparency, we cannot have a good partnership with this new technology. As I mentioned, we have a good experience as music sector of partnership with platforms. We started being concerned, we started a little bit fighting them, but now at the end of the day, we sort of found a solution with good actors to maximize the value on both sides. And we think that transparency is really the future-proofing tool to do that. Is the text of the parliament sufficient? I would agree with Paul that probably the requirements should be a little bit more exhaustive in terms of transparency. It shouldn't be limited, I agree, to copyright, because artists do not care only about copyright, but as it was mentioned before, they care about many other things. I think that you have data, you have image, you have personality, you have plenty of things that are relevant to protect the integrity of an artist, which is much more than copyright. So yeah, I would really agree that has been a clear advancement in the discussion, and luckily the Parliament intervened at the right time of the discussion, and I think that the Commission and the Council should certainly follow. Coming back to Paul again, I agreed also on one aspect. I think that we have a good framework, and we should make it work in the EU.
Great, thank you. I would like to also pick back up on Paul's point there about the text and data mining and the ability, the exclusion and opt-outs for right holders. Maybe Andreas, would you be able to provide some insight on that, and how you're seeing the EU's AI Act address it effectively?
Okay, I have a bit of a problem here because I'm not European. I live outside of the Union. I live in the UK, and I'm Costa Rican, so I can say anything I want. I'm in Paris right now, but that's beside the point. One of the issues that I'm starting to see with this is, how is this all going to work? I like transparency. I like the transparency requirements. I'm concerned. I'm really concerned about how everything is going to operate with the already existing framework that Paul was explaining. So we have the Articles 3 and 4 from the Digital Single Market Directive. One has an opt-out provision. The first question everyone, particularly in some industries and some lawyers, have been saying, we don't like this. It's a very broad exception. This was thought about and explored in an era when we were thinking about all fuzzy, nice, cure for cancer type of text and data mining. And here we are through a couple of years later, and we have an entirely different situation in which rights holders are crying foul. When this was adopted, it was adopted in a different world. Since last year, we are living in a different world. So This is the first thing. I don't know how they're going to interact. I have no idea how the transparency requirement is going to interact with the existing provisions, with the existing exceptions. What you are asking, and I think this is the main criticism that I have on the transparency provisions, particularly for foundational models, is that you're telling the creators of artificial intelligence datasets, you're putting a big sign of "pick me" on the back, because what's going to happen is they're going to put this transparency things let's say all of the list of all of the works that the views that are under copyright, and the first thing is going to happen is that all of the people in that list are going to sue for copyright infringement. So how is that going to work with the protections that were created specifically to avoid this from happening? So this is the first concern that I have. The second one is, again, coming from outside of the union, what's going to happen in reality is all of the artificial intelligence industry is going to move to London, which is already going to, is already, I know that there are provisions to stop this from happening, but what we're going to have is potentially Europe being completely and absolutely shut down from the world. So just keep that in mind. You have an enemy a few miles down the road. By the way, I'm completely anti-Brexit. It's made my life very, very, very difficult. So you have to think of how this is going to work, how this is going to operate, and potentially what we have is Europe becoming this huge closed-off area. If you remember, after GDPR, what happened is that lots of providers were saying, okay, we're not going to have any content to Europe. The third concern that I have potentially with this interaction is that this is still a few years happening. Think back just last year. Just last year, what happened is that this time last year, we were still looking at silly mini DALL-E images. This thing changes so quickly that when the AI Act is going to be implemented, we're going to have potentially 3 years already of foundational models that are not going to be covered. So we are looking at potentially already everything being raced ahead. I don't know how it's going to work retroactively. Is the registration or sort of this registration going to be retroactive? In that, if that is the case, you are going to be looking at the future of years of these being taken to the Court of Justice. Sorry, that was a bit of a rant.
Thanks, Andreas. Thank you. Yeah, a lot of very important questions raised there, and I would like to let everyone have a chance to pick up on any of those. But particularly, you were saying in relation to innovation moving towards the UK and the effects of GDPR, and I think someone already posted a comment in the chat saying, well, you know, the EU became a global leader in data regulation following GDPR. And I think AI, in particular generative AI, has been one of the few policy areas where we're actually seeing industry call for regulation. But at the same time, you're absolutely right. There has been many critics saying that we're becoming, it's maybe perhaps too prescriptive, and we risk hindering innovation in the EU. So open to, yeah, I see some hands up there. Paul, if you want to go ahead.
Sorry, I think Lodovico raised his hand first.
Oh, sorry.
But let me disagree a little bit with Andres here, right? Like, and sort of, it's funny that I'm disagreeing with you and not other people on the panel. So this is obviously the luxury you have as an academic, right? Like, there is no way that we're not making rules on this. Like, this is very foundational technology, which has all kinds of impacts, from maybe I don't want to disrespect Emily's concerns, like slightly banal, to like really questions about sort of like the viability of certain business models of certain types of creators, to questions about democracy, which I think, Emily, you also rightfully highlighted. So there's no question that we're not regulating this, and I think we need to regulate on principle and not on concerns if there's like some small island off the northern coast that might steal away one or two innovative companies from us, right? And I think the interesting thing here is that we're seeing a lot of different concerns, right? Like, and copyright assumes that everybody who creates copyrighted works creates with the same intentions. And I think that is not necessarily true here if we look at this, and that's why this European system with like the ability to opt out actually is quite powerful, because we can make distinctions between those who want to exclude their oeuvre, their creation from these systems, versus those who honestly, like some people who like us write texts for like and want them to be as widely circulated and influence discussions. I want my thinking feed into the machine so that the machine actually promotes sort of ideas that I have, but that calculation can be completely different from somebody who writes fiction for a living or who creates music for a living or whatever. And I think like the interesting thing is here we've approached this thing with the ability to offer different treatments to different types of rights holders, creators, and there is a sense of agency in there where people can position themselves, can make deliberate choices. And I think it's going to be very interesting to see how people will execute that. What's most interesting to me is honestly not how people will opt out, but what people will do when they have opted out. And then what do they do? Like, there's ideas about creators sort of like not necessarily building their careers on the basis of selling recordings, but selling sort of like style, voice, identity. Like, there's people who are like thinking about creating like their own particular models, which can then become a commodity that is traded and that gives impressions. So like, I think I think both Emily and Ludovico pointed to this, like we're probably seeing like an explosion of different, entirely new forms of creativity here. And I'm looking forward, and a bit of, to contradict you, Andreas, a bit of regulation, a bit of like constraints have always been good for creativity, right? Like, because people find interesting ways of working with these constraints and build on top of that.
By the way, I'm not saying that there shouldn't be regulation. Completely different. I'm concerned about the interaction between all the regulations. Is what I'm saying. I have no idea how this is going to work.
But on this, if I may, can be reassuring in the sense that we are a global organization and we follow the debates in the UK, in the US, and I'm hopeful that the EU is just the first mover on this topic, because this is really high in the agenda everywhere. And when we talk about the UK, let's not forget that the UK, at least for the music industry, but not only, has a great creative sector. So it could work the other way around. Does the UK want to lose out on that front where they are so strong because of the fact that they have a too loose treatment of AI creation, artificial intelligence? So I'm actually quite optimistic. I don't think that there will be many safe harbors among the countries that we are following.
Just to jump in on the same idea, sorry, Lydia, I'm not going to be taking more than 2 minutes. Piggybacking on Lodovico's point, I just wrote down in my notes that, you know, our office maintains a very, very close relationship. We really care about the transatlantic relationship, so we have very good contacts in the US. And in the last month or so, the US Congress, just like Parliament, you know, sometimes slower to react than the market. But, you know, we were there in September and we had conversations, and people were at a very primitive level of understanding of what, you know, AI regulation could look like. And I can tell you now from the interactions that we have with Congress in particular, that they're really on, you know, on something. They're high speed training themselves on AI regulation. They're asking questions. It's the new thing in Congress now to understand AI and how to regulate it. And of course, this shift in the mood in Congress is probably just a reaction of the shift in the public perception. So I totally support what Lodovico was saying, that there is going to be regulation, not just in Europe, It's going to be in a different regulatory environment, different regulatory tradition, but it's going to be in the US as well. They've been talking about it at the G7 as well. So slowly, this is not just going to be a Europe that shuts itself off, but hopefully a Europe that leads the way.
Fantastic, thanks. And before we turn to audience questions, Emily, I'd like to give you a few minutes if you
yeah, just a quick note on what Dan just said, because it is indeed interesting and complex, of course, this global implication, as Andres said. Mentioned the UK, someone in the chat mentioned China. We know that there are exceptions elsewhere in the world as well for this. And just to pick up on what Dan said about the US, what I think is, of course, an extra challenge when it comes to these copyright questions is the different traditions between copyright exceptions and fair use. We are looking at it here from the Article 4 text and data mining exception with the opt-out and about the enforcement of the transparency, the opt-out with transparency. But of course, in the US, they look at it from a fair use angle, which is slightly different in the sense that in Europe, if there is a reproduction that is a copyright relevant act, that needs to be authorized unless it is covered by an exception. While in the US, under fair use, you have all these factors where you have to compare the output and the input and see how they compete, etc. So that is a fundamentally different approach, meaning that in the US, it will be much more of a case-by-case analysis, whether there is something infringing happening, while under EU, the mere reproduction, regardless of the output, would actually be copyright relevant. So just putting it out there that is an extra challenge when we look at these issues globally.
Absolutely, thank you. So we have time for a couple of questions from the audience. So Carlos asks, AI companies are making the argument that scraping copyrighted work is no different than a search engine crawling and indexing these material. Any thoughts on this? Open floor to anyone who wants to answer.
It's not the same thing as the copyright person. It is more than that. Now, some scraping can take can be like search engine scraping, but not all of them. There's usually going to be a copy at some point. If you want to extract any information from data, from be it text, music, images, you need to create a copy, even if it's a temporary copy. That's why we have exceptions in some countries. So it's very different. It's not like indexing the internet at all.
Thanks, Andres. We have a question from Fabio. It would be great if Dan could explain what the Parliament means by transparency of AI systems. I think we touched upon this briefly, but if you'd like to develop further on that.
I think if we have another hour, I could go into the whole topic, but I think that, you know, in a regulation that was proposed is 108 pages and we turned it into 150 or so. Transparency is everywhere. I'll give a few examples. So one is for the AI systems that are falling under the high risk category of the regulation, meaning that they will have to do some additional things to be safe. Transparency means maintaining documentation, documenting risks, having all of that available to market surveillance authorities when they verify them. Transparency in the case of certain systems that require end user transparency. These are, you know, just informing the user that they're dealing with a chatbot, with a deep fake, with something that with an AI system, so that they're not misled to believe that they are interacting with a human at the other end, or that they see something created by another human. And to our conversation, in the particular provisions that we propose on generative AI, transparency means exactly that report of how did you use copyrighted material so that you have that information publicly available. And the last one is more technical, but it's registration requirements for certain systems that are deemed to be high risk to be registered in a public database. And for public authorities, which is something that the Parliament really cares about, going back to Emily's very good point on democracy, public authorities using these systems that are high risk, also registering their use and making that publicly available. So it's not just one thing. I think it goes across the text. It's more of a principle that we try to apply to every single part of the text than just one single article that deals just with transparency. Hope this answers it briefly.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. And one last question. So we have spoken a lot about copyright of input data. Rod asks, are there any thoughts on the ownership of works produced by AI and the ability to copyright patent works designs produced by AI? Who would like to address this one?
I can. Oh, Andreas, please. You are the most appropriate person, maybe to answer this question.
Maybe that one. I've written a lot about this, so bear with me. It's very jurisdiction dependent. We have case law in China that has allowed the works to be protected. In the UK, India, New Zealand, Ireland, there is a provision that allows for the protection for limited copyright of 50 years without moral rights for the person that made it possible for the work to be created. So it's the wording is a little bit complicated. In the US, it's up in the air, but the US Copyright Office appears to be leaning against any sort of creativity of ownership. So, and Europe?
And Europe?
Europe, is it intellectual creation? I think that some works, we haven't had a test. I think it may depend on case-by-case basis. Things like, I don't know if people remember the new Rembrandt, that painting, that took a lot of work and a lot of human intervention. I think that would have copyright. If you type something into ChatGPT, I don't think that shows intellectual creation. It's a case-by-case basis. It depends on how you have to prove that there is an intellectual creation on that. Yeah, so it's very, very, very complicated.
But sorry, one thing, Emily, I know you want to speak, but just as far as we are concerned, if we have to indicate what would be the right direction, is the one expressed by the Copyright Office in the US, which is that you need to have a significant human creation in order to be protected.
Yeah, I don't disagree with that. I think the existing concepts of originality, for example, in Europe, or the criteria in the US probably just apply to this indeed. I mean, is it the expression of the personality of the author? Can you retrieve it? So it's probably a question about, is it only the machine, or what is the contribution? I don't think this is an impossible question that necessarily needs legislative intervention. I think it's up to the courts to make that assessment on a case-by-case basis.
Paul, please go ahead.
Yeah, at the risk of being boring, like I think we fully also agree, like there's absolutely no need to think about some kind of like new rights in this space, right? This is, in the end, I think we all agree to some degree AI can be a tool, and as far as it's used by humans as a tool, then this is something that the copyright system very well knows how to deal with. It depends what you do with the tool, like how you handle that, and where it is machines spewing out stuff by themselves, like that is not what the copyright system has been intended for. You can imagine people wanting to own that stuff, but it's absolutely unnecessary.
Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone. That's unfortunately all the time that we have for today, even though we could go on for hours. So thank you, everyone, for joining. Just briefly to mention, earlier I mentioned we'd have an announcement later. I'm delighted to announce that Access Partnership will be hosting our Tech Policy Exchange on September 19th in London, and also live streamed for our audience abroad. This year's theme is on expanding technological frontiers in emerging markets. So if you are interested and you want to attend in person, there will be limited attendance to ensure meaningful exchange. So please do check out the link in the chat. And if we didn't get a chance to address any of your questions today and you want to keep in touch, please also feel free to reach out to us. You can reach out to me directly, lydia.detling@accesspartnership.com. So have a wonderful rest of the day, everyone, and thank you again to our panelists.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for having us. Bye, everybody.
Thanks.
Goodbye.
Bye.